It was on their 20th anniversary when Linda finally made a decision that would change everything. She filed for divorce. For the first time, she chose herself over him. For the first time in 2 decades, Linda broke the unspoken rule of their marriage: never defy Mark. The moment he received those papers, witnesses say Mark's demeanor changed. His polished public mask cracked. A storm was brewing beneath the surface, and Linda had unknowingly lit the fuse. Mark had always been the charming one, handsome, well-spoken, admired in their community. People called them the perfect couple. But what no one knew was that behind closed doors, perfection was just a performance. Linda endured years of control, his temper lurking in the shadows, his anger disguised as passion, his dominance wrapped in the language of love. And for 20 long years, she stayed silent. She smiled at dinners, she laughed at church, she played her role, but deep inside, she was crumbling. Filing for divorce was her rebellion, her first act of freedom, her way of saying enough. And for a moment, she felt powerful. She spoke to friends of plans, she made lists of dreams, she even dared to smile again. But Mark wasn't ready to let go. Control wasn't something he lost easily. First, he tried charm, flowers, dinners, whispered promises that sounded sweet but felt hollow. When charm failed, he tried guilt. Memories of their early years twisted into weapons of shame. But Linda stood firm. For once, she was choosing herself, and that act of defiance cut him deeper than any blade ever could. Neighbors recall seeing Mark pacing the yard at night, talking to himself, eyes dark with rage. He told friends she was confused, she didn't know what she wanted. But in truth, it was he who couldn't bear the thought of losing her. Not because he loved her, but because without her he would be nothing. Linda had been the canvas on which he painted his perfect image, and now she was erasing it, stroke by stroke. As the court date drew closer, Mark's mask slipped further. He grew colder in public, sharper at home. Linda confided in her sister that she felt watched, that even in her own house, she no longer felt safe. She considered a restraining order, but part of her still clung to the hope that Mark would let her go peacefully. After all, 20 years is a long time, too long to believe the monster could truly win. But monsters don't always hide in shadows. Sometimes they stand right beside you, dressed in wedding rings and vows. Linda didn't know that by defying him, she had written her final chapter. On a quiet evening in their home, police would later describe the scene as chilling. Linda had been preparing dinner when Mark walked in, calm, collected, too calm. He spoke softly, almost tenderly, but behind that calm was a decision already made. He had convinced himself that if he couldn't have her, no one would. And that night, he made good on his vow. The call came hours later. Neighbors reported screams, then silence. When officers arrived, what they found was a picture of horror. Linda's body still on the kitchen floor, Mark sitting nearby, expression blank as though the life had already drained from him. He didn't run. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He simply stared at the woman he claimed to love for 20 years, now lifeless, because she dared to choose freedom over fear. At trial, the courtroom heard 2 versions of Mark. The community's Mark, the smiling husband, the church volunteer, the man who always shook hands and told jokes. And then Linda's Mark, the manipulator, the controller, the man who hid his rage behind closed doors. Jurors were forced to reconcile the mask with the monster. And in the end, they chose truth over image. Mark was convicted, his mask forever shattered. But this story doesn't end neatly. Because what justice can bring back a stolen life? What verdict can erase 2 decades of silence? What sentence can heal the pain of children left without a mother? Linda's story is a haunting reminder that sometimes the greatest danger isn't a stranger in the dark, but the person who swore to love you forever. Vows meant to protect became chains. Vows meant to honor became weapons. Vows meant to unite became deadly. And just when the town thought the nightmare was over, another revelation emerged, one that no one expected. A discovery that would shake the community even deeper than Linda's tragic death. What Mark had hidden, what investigators would uncover in the weeks after his arrest, was something darker. Something far more chilling than anyone imagined. When investigators searched Mark's home after Linda's death, they expected to find grief. They expected maybe notes or letters, maybe signs of a marriage in collapse. But what they uncovered was something far more sinister. Hidden inside his study, tucked away behind perfectly stacked files, was a locked drawer. And inside that drawer lay a collection that chilled detectives to the bone. Photographs. Dozens of them. Each one carefully dated, neatly organized. women's faces staring back from the glossy paper. Linda's smile among them, but she wasn't the only one. There were others. Women from years past. Women who looked eerily like Linda. All dark-haired, all gentle-eyed, all carefully chosen. Detectives began digging into Mark's past, into jobs he held, towns he'd lived in, relationships that seemed to vanish without explanation. And what they found was a trail, cold but undeniable. Women who had disappeared. Women whose families still carried open wounds. Women whose cases had grown dusty in forgotten police archives. Neighbors recalled how Mark always seemed too perfect, too polished. How his charm sometimes felt rehearsed, like a mask he wore. And now police were beginning to realize that mask wasn't just for Linda. It had been his armor, his camouflage, his way of hunting in plain sight. As the investigation widened, Linda's sister made a chilling discovery of her own. While going through her sister's belongings, she found an old journal, a private record Linda had kept over the years. In it, Linda described her growing fear, her suspicion that Mark wasn't just controlling, but dangerous. She wrote about nights he disappeared, unexplained trips, business meetings, that never quite added up. In one entry, written just months before her death, Linda confessed that she feared she wasn't his first victim. She wrote, "He has secrets buried so deep. I pray I never find out the truth." Those words would soon prove prophetic, because what police uncovered next shocked even seasoned detectives. Hidden within Mark's basement, buried beneath years of stored boxes, was a small trunk. Inside were personal items that didn't belong to Linda. A locket engraved with initials she didn't recognize, a scarf still faintly scented with perfume, a driver's license belonging to a woman missing since 2003. Piece by piece, the picture sharpened. Mark wasn't just a husband who snapped. Mark was a predator, patient, methodical, and terrifyingly ordinary. At trial, prosecutors painted him not as a man who lost control, but as a man who had perfected it for years. They suggested that Linda's death was the culmination, not the exception. That Mark had been rehearsing for 2 decades, practicing deception, hiding behind charm, until finally his mask cracked too wide to conceal. Jurors sat in stunned silence as evidence was laid out. His double life, his secret drawer, his trophies of past victims. And with each piece of evidence, the image of the perfect husband faded, replaced by something darker, something far more monstrous. But just when everyone thought the case had reached its darkest point, another revelation surfaced. One that would force even the most hardened investigators to question everything they thought they knew. Because buried in Mark's hidden belongings was a letter, sealed, dated nearly 15 years earlier. A letter addressed not to Linda, not to a lover, not even to family, but to someone else entirely, someone still alive, someone who had been closer to him than anyone realized. That letter hinted at an accomplice. The letter found in Mark's belongings was yellowed with age, its edges frayed, as though it had been opened and closed many times, but never discarded. Detectives unfolded it carefully, and what they read made their blood run cold. It wasn't just a confession, it was a conversation. An exchange between Mark and someone else. Someone he trusted deeply. Someone who had known about his darkness all along. The handwriting was familiar to many in the small community, because it belonged to Pastor Raymond, the very man who had counseled Linda and Mark through their marriage. The man who stood at the pulpit preaching love, loyalty, and forgiveness. The man neighbors looked to as a moral compass. He wasn't just Mark's confidant, he was his enabler. The letter detailed how Raymond had urged Mark to preserve his marriage at all costs. How vows were sacred, how women were meant to endure and obey. But in between the lines, there was more. He hinted at secrets. He promised silence. He reminded Mark that appearances were everything. Protect the mask, keep the family image clean. The words now read less like guidance and more like collaboration. When confronted, the pastor denied everything. But investigators uncovered years of private meetings, late-night conversations, phone calls that stretched for hours. Mark hadn't been spiraling alone. He had been feeding off someone who validated his control, someone who cloaked abuse in scripture and tradition. Prosecutors painted Raymond not as a killer, but as an accomplice to silence. a man who knew too much and said too little, while women suffered. The courtroom gasped as the letters were read aloud. Linda's family wept because the betrayal cut even deeper. The man she once sought for comfort, the man she trusted with her tears, had been whispering in her husband's ear all along, reinforcing his delusions, feeding his control, making her fight for freedom all the more impossible. In the end, Mark was sentenced to life without parole, his mask forever stripped away. Pastor Raymond faced charges of obstruction of justice and conspiracy, his reputation shattered, his flock scattered. The community left to grapple with the horrifying realization that evil can hide not only in husbands, but in shepherds too. Linda's story became more than a tale of domestic betrayal. It became a warning that silence is complicity, that power without accountability becomes a weapon, that love twisted by control becomes deadly. Her sister now speaks publicly, urging women to trust their instincts, to recognize the signs, to never dismiss the quiet red flags that whisper long before they scream. Deadly vows are not written in blood. They are written in silence, in control, in the masks we fail to question. Linda's death exposed more than a marriage. It exposed a system that allowed charm to outweigh truth, appearances to outweigh safety, tradition to outweigh justice. Had Mark been hunting under the protection of a man cloaked in faith? Had the pastor not only known, but helped shield him from suspicion? The possibility was almost too dark to comprehend. Linda's sister remembered how Carter always dismissed Linda's concerns when she spoke of Mark's temper, how he told her to pray harder, to submit more fully to her husband's will. Was it blind faith or deliberate manipulation? Police interrogated Carter, and at first, he denied everything. But when confronted with Mark's letter, his composure cracked. He admitted that Mark had come to him over the years, confessed sins that were more than marital struggles, but less than murder. He claimed he never thought Mark was serious, that it was just dark fantasy spilling into words. Yet his silence allowed those fantasies to grow into reality. The prosecution now faced an even bigger storm. This wasn't just the story of a murderous husband. It was the story of an institution that had enabled him, knowingly or not, a pastor who had counseled silence instead of safety, obedience instead of escape. The community was split. Some still defended Carter, swearing he was a victim of Mark's manipulation. Others demanded his arrest, accusing him of complicity. But detectives weren't finished with him. Not yet, because the letter hinted at more. It spoke of nights when Mark was not alone, nights when we watched her together, nights when you reminded me that the Lord forgives. That single word turned the investigation on its head. If Mark hadn't always acted alone, who else had been there? Who else knew? And who else still walked free? And as detectives followed that thread deeper into Mark's hidden world, what they uncovered next would shatter the illusion of safety forever. Because Mark's accomplice wasn't who anyone expected. It wasn't just a man of God, it was someone closer to Linda, someone who should have been her protector, not her betrayer. It wasn't until detectives dug into the family's old journals, phone records, and hidden bank accounts that the truth finally emerged. The accomplice, the person no one had suspected, the one who had quietly lived under the same roof, shared meals, holidays, and secrets, was Linda's own sister, Marissa. Marissa had always seemed devoted, the perfect confidant, someone who would quietly support her sister through every hardship. But behind closed doors, she had been complicit in Mark's darkest impulses, feeding his insecurities, covering up his transgressions, and manipulating the narrative to keep Linda under his control. Detectives learned Marissa had acted out of a twisted sense of loyalty, or perhaps fear. But the evidence was undeniable. She had been the one to intercept calls, remove incriminating texts, and even guide Mark when his temper had threatened to expose him before the final, fatal act. She had hidden money, erased digital footprints, and made sure the family's darkest moments stayed behind closed doors. Confronted with the evidence, Marissa crumbled. Her confession was chillingly matter-of-fact. She admitted that Mark had convinced her that their actions were necessary, that they were preserving the family, that this was God's plan, but deep down she knew the truth. Deep down, she had chosen complicity over courage. For Linda, the betrayal cut deeper than any act of violence. To survive the horror of Mark, only to realize her own sister had aided him, was a betrayal that left scars far beyond the physical. It was the ultimate betrayal, the kind that leaves you questioning every smile, every embrace, every word spoken over decades. Yet, even in the darkest moments, Linda found a glimmer of power. Justice had arrived, not in the form of immediate relief, but through truth. Mark was gone. Marissa was in custody, facing charges that carried the full weight of her complicity. The twisted network that had enabled Mark's crimes was exposed, stripped of every illusion of safety or righteousness. The community struggled to process the shock. The pastor they had trusted, the sister they had loved, the family they admired, every image of perfection shattered. People asked how this could happen, how someone could hide such darkness, and how they themselves could have been blind. And Linda? She began the slow process of reclaiming her life. Therapy, protective custody, and time became her tools for survival. She learned that strength isn't always about the dramatic acts of heroism. It's about enduring the unendurable, holding on to clarity while surrounded by chaos, and refusing to let the darkness define you. But even in her survival, Linda carried a lesson for all of us. Trust is precious, and appearances can be deadly. Power can corrupt silently, often hiding behind the most familiar faces. And sometimes, the ones you think will protect you are the ones who choose their own survival over yours. The story of Deadly Vows didn't end with a courtroom or a headline. It ended with the truth revealed, the guilty confronted, and a survivor standing in the ashes of betrayal, knowing she had reclaimed something Mark and Marissa could never take, control over her own destiny. What would you have done if you were in Linda's shoes? Could you have faced the ultimate betrayal and still found the strength to survive? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this story shook you, made you question the people you trust, or left you thinking twice about appearances, make sure to subscribe to Behind Crime Scene, like this video, and turn on notifications. We bring you the real, the raw, and the hidden. Stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore what doesn't sit right.